The first thing Earl Whittaker noticed wasn't the cold. It was the sound, or rather the absence of it. No wind rattling the loose tin on the barn. No lowing from the cattle beyond the frozen fence line. Not even the crows that usually haunted the cottonwoods along the creek. The world outside his kitchen window looked like a photograph left out in the sun too long, washed pale, brittle, wrong. Earl stood there with his coffee growing cold in his hands, staring at a sky the color of old aluminum. "Here we go," he muttered. 74 winters had taught Earl Whittaker how to read weather better than any forecast. He could feel it in the ache behind his left knee, in the way his breath caught when he inhaled too deep. This wasn't just another cold snap. This one had weight to it, the kind that settled in and didn't let go. The ranch lay 20 miles outside of Laramie, Wyoming, land so wide it made most people uncomfortable. Earl's grandfather had homesteaded it with a mule and more nerve than sense. His father had expanded it. Earl had spent his entire life trying to hold on to what was left. The radio crackled from the counter. National Weather Service, confirming the coldest sustained temperatures in over 50 years. Earl reached over and shut it off. Didn't need a man in a studio to tell him what his bones already knew. Behind him, the house creaked softly as it always did in the cold. Not in a complaining way, more like it was clearing its throat. The walls were thick, thicker than most. Unusual. Folks had laughed about that, too. The hay house. Earl pulled on his coat and stepped outside. The cold bit immediately, sharp and personal. Frost glittered across the pasture, turning every blade of grass into a needle. His breath came out in white plumes as he walked the short distance to the barn, boots crunching in the frozen dirt. From the road, the house looked odd. Hay bales stacked neatly along the exterior walls, packed tight behind wooden slats like insulation on steroids. Golden rectangles wrapped the house from foundation to eaves. It looked less like a home and more like something halfway between a fort and a joke. That's what the neighbors had called it. A joke. 2 summers back, when Earl had started stacking hay against the house, people slowed their trucks just to gawk. One guy had shouted, "You building a nest for a giant bird, Earl." Another had laughed outright, "That stuff'll rot or burn or both." Earl hadn't argued. He never did. He just kept stacking bale by bale, sweat darkening his shirt, hands moving with the patience of someone who knew time would prove its own point. He hadn't done it for laughs. He'd done it because heating oil prices had doubled, and the old house leaked warmth like a sieve. Because winters weren't what they used to be, shorter, harsher, more unpredictable. Because his daughter had moved back home with 2 kids and nowhere else to go. Family changes things. Inside the barn, Earl checked the cattle quickly, healthy, restless, aware something was coming. He ran a hand along the flank of his oldest cow, Bess, feeling the tension beneath the hide. "Gonna be a rough one," he told her. Bess flicked an ear. That was answer enough. By dusk, the temperature dropped like a rock. The wind came first, screaming down off the mountains with a force that rattled fence posts and sent powdery snow slithering across the ground. Clouds swallowed what little light remained, and the world closed in fast. Inside the house, Earl's daughter, Maggie, stood at the kitchen window with her arms wrapped tight around herself. "You sure this is gonna work?" she asked. She didn't mean the storm, she meant the walls. Maggie was 36, worn thin by years of bad luck and harder lessons. She'd left for Cheyenne once, then Denver, chasing jobs that vanished just as quickly. She'd come home with 2 kids, Sam, 12, and Lily, 8, and the kind of exhaustion that settled into your voice. Earl set another log into the wood stove. "It's worked so far." That's not exactly reassuring. He smiled faintly. "Neither is winter." The kids sat on the floor playing cards, bundled in sweaters. Sam kept glancing toward the windows, watching the snow thicken. Lily leaned against the wall, cheek pressed to the wood, eyes half closed. "It's warm," she said quietly. Maggie frowned. "It is." That was the first thing that made her nervous. When the power went out an hour later, no one screamed. The lights flickered once, twice. Then darkness. Sam sucked in a breath. Grandpa. Earl was already moving, lighting lanterns with steady hands. The house didn't change much after that. The walls held the heat. The stove burned slow. The air stayed livable. Outside, the storm found its voice. The wind howled like something alive, slamming snow against the hay-covered walls. It sounded different than usual, muted, absorbed. The house didn't shudder the way it used to. It just endured. They ate soup by lantern light. They laughed once or twice, at nothing in particular. But beneath it all ran a current of fear Earl recognized too well. This was only the beginning. By morning, the world was gone. Snow buried the fence lines. The barn roof wore a white crown thick enough to make Earl uneasy. The thermometer nailed to the porch read -25 and falling. The radio, running on batteries now, spit out grim news. Highway closures, stranded motorists, rolling blackouts in town. A shelter opened at the high school gym for folks whose furnaces failed overnight. Maggie listened, lips pressed thin. "Maybe we should go," she said. Earl didn't answer right away. He stared at the hay-packed wall near the door, resting his palm against it. The surface was cold, but not like the bare wood beneath would have been, not biting. Outside, the wind shrieked again. "Road's already drifting shut," he said finally, "and that shelter won't have walls like these." Maggie swallowed. "You're really betting on hay." Earl met her eyes. "I'm betting on common sense people forgot." Another gust slammed into the house. Inside, Lily laughed. "Sounds like a monster," she said. Earl smiled despite himself. Monsters get tired. The storm didn't. By the third day, the temperature dropped below -40. Diesel gelled, pipes froze. A neighbor 2 miles down lost heat entirely and had to be evacuated by snowmobile. Another family tried to leave and got stuck less than half a mile from their driveway. Through it all, the Whittaker house stayed warm enough to breathe without pain. Warm enough to survive. Earl checked the walls twice a day, packing loose hay, knocking ice free, working until his fingers burned even through gloves. The hay darkened in spots where moisture froze, but it held. At night, he lay awake listening to the storm test his handiwork, wondering if this was the night it failed. And wondering if, by morning, the thing everyone called crazy would be the only thing standing between his family and the cold. The worst winter in 50 years had only just begun. By day 4, the cold stopped feeling like weather and started feeling like an enemy with a plan. It crept into places Earl didn't expect, into the hinges of doors, into the grain of the table, into the spaces between words. Every movement felt deliberate now, measured against the risk of wasting energy or making a mistake you couldn't undo. The storm didn't rage nonstop anymore. That almost made it worse. The quiet stretches were heavy, watchful, like the winter was waiting for them to slip. Earl woke before dawn the way he always had, but the house felt different when he swung his feet to the floor. Still warm, still holding, but the warmth was thinner, stretched tighter. He pulled on his boots and coat without waking anyone and stepped outside. The sky was clear for the first time in days, stars sharp and merciless above him. The cold hit like a punch. His mustache stiffened instantly, breath crystallizing before it could drift away. He stood still for a moment, listening. The house loomed behind him, squat and strange in the moonlight. Hay bales rimmed with ice. Snow packed hard against the lower walls like concrete. From a distance, it looked less ridiculous now, more intentional, like something built to last. Earl ran his gloved hand along the exterior. Solid. The hay had frozen into a dense shell, trapping air inside the fibers. Insulation the old way. The way his grandfather talked about when lumber was scarce and winters were unforgiving. "Don't fail me now," Earl murmured. A sharp crack echoed in the distance. Not thunder, wood splitting. He turned toward the sound, heart tightening. The barns. Earl trudged through knee-deep snow, each step an effort. When he reached the structure, he saw it immediately, a long split running down one of the support beams, widened by the cold. The roof sagged just enough to make his stomach drop. Inside, the cattle shifted nervously. "Easy," he said, voice low. "Easy." He knew what this meant. If the barn failed, the animals would be exposed. And if he lost them, he lost everything. Insurance wouldn't cover weather like this. Not fully, not fast enough. He worked for an hour reinforcing the beam with spare lumber and frozen bolts, fingers numb despite his gloves. By the time he finished, the sun had crept over the horizon, pale and useless. Back at the house, Maggie was waiting for him. "You didn't wake me," she said. Earl shrugged, didn't need help. She didn't argue. She just handed him a mug of coffee and studied his face. "You're pushing yourself," she said quietly. "So is winter." She exhaled slowly. "Radio says the town's running out of fuel. They're asking people to conserve heat." Earl snorted. "They can ask." "That's not what I meant," Maggie hesitated. "If this keeps up, we might not get help if something goes wrong." Earl looked past her, toward the kids. Sam sat at the table pretending to do homework, pencil tapping too fast. Lily colored with mittens on, refusing to take them off now. "Then we make sure nothing goes wrong," Earl said. By the end of the week, word had spread. It started with a snowmobile pulling into the yard late one afternoon. Earl watched from the porch as his neighbor, Hank Dawson, climbed off stiffly, face red and chapped raw. "You alive over here?" Hank called. "Last I checked," Earl said. Hank squinted at the house, the hay, the steam drifting lazily from the chimney. "I'll be damned." Inside, Hank took off his gloves and held his hands out, eyes widening as the warmth hit him. "It's warmer in here than my place ever was," he said. Maggie poured him coffee. "Your furnace okay?" Hank shook his head. "Dead as a doornail. Pipes froze solid. Been staying with my brother, but he's got 6 people crammed into a place half this size." Hank looked at Earl. "You really did it, didn't you?" Earl shrugged again, uncomfortable with the attention. "Didn't do anything special." "Like hell you didn't." Hank leaned back, studying the walls. "You think this could work for other folks?" That question lingered in the air long after Hank left. The next day, another neighbor came by. Then another. Some brought supplies, others brought nothing but curiosity and desperation. One man laughed nervously. "My wife said I was crazy to come look, said you finally lost it." Earl didn't smile. "Funny thing about crazy," he said, "works until it doesn't." By nightfall, Maggie pulled him aside. "Dad," she said, keeping her voice low, "people are talking." "People always do. They're saying if this keeps up, more folks might come, asking for help." Earl's jaw tightened. He hadn't built the walls to be a hero, he'd built them to survive. "We don't have room," he said. "I know," Maggie said, "but we have heat." That word landed hard. Heat. Outside, the temperature plunged again, -45 now. The cold settled deep into the land, cracking trees like gunshots in the distance. The sky stayed cruelly clear, offering no insulation of cloud. That night, the wind returned with a vengeance. It found a weak spot. Earl heard it before he saw it, a low, hollow thump against the west wall. He was on his feet instantly, pulling on boots, heart hammering. Snow had drifted high against the hay, pressing hard, too hard. One section sagged inward slightly, the wooden slats creaking in protest. "Dad," Maggie called from behind him. "What's happening?" Earl grabbed his shovel. "Snow load, too much weight." Sam appeared in the doorway, eyes wide. "Is the house gonna fall down?" Earl forced his voice steady. "Not if I can help it." He attacked the drift, shoveling frantically, muscles screaming. Hank's words echoed in his head, "Works until it doesn't." The wind howled, stealing his breath. Ice burned his lungs, his hands shook as fatigue set in. Maggie came out beside him without a word, shoveling too. Then Sam. Then Lily pushing snow with a tiny plastic scoop, face set in fierce concentration. "Go inside," Earl shouted. "No," Maggie yelled back. "We're not leaving you out here." For a moment, just a moment, fear threatened to overwhelm him, not fear for himself, for them. A loud crack sounded from the wall. Everyone froze. The hay held. Barely. They worked until their arms went numb and the drift relented, snow falling away from the wall in heavy slabs. When they finally staggered inside, the house felt warmer than ever. Or maybe that was relief. Earl sank into a chair, chest heaving. Maggie knelt in front of him. "You scared me," she said. Earl looked at his hands, raw and shaking. "I scared myself." Later that night, as the kids slept curled together under blankets, Maggie sat beside him at the table. "Dad," she said softly, "if this fails, what then?" Earl stared at the lantern flame, steady and small. "Then we fail," he said, "but not without fighting." Outside, the storm gathered itself again. And somewhere beyond the ranch, more people realized just how dangerous this winter truly was. The fifth day arrived with a silence that felt heavier than the wind. Earl woke before dawn, as he always did, but today the world felt different. The snow, once fluffy and shifting, had hardened into something relentless. Each step outside was a crunch of ice that sank into your bones. The temperature hovered in the mid-40s, and Earl could see the frost creeping along the insides of the windows like a web. He knew the hay walls were holding, but for how long? He stepped onto the porch, lantern in hand, and scanned the horizon. Everything beyond the fence line was white. The cattle were safe, huddled in the barn and in the small paddock he had managed to clear, but their breaths curled like smoke in the frozen air. Every exhale from the animals reminded him of the warmth the hay walls had preserved, but it so reminded him how precarious that warmth was. The first warning came as a low, groaning creak. Earl froze mid-step. His eyes darted to the west wall of the house. The bales were bowing slightly under the weight of ice and snow. It wasn't catastrophic yet, but it was enough to make his chest tighten. He ran inside to grab the kids. "Sam, Lily, get your coats. Maggie, we're moving." His voice had that sharp edge it always took when survival was at stake. Maggie rounded up the children while Earl grabbed the rope and ladder. The plan was simple: redistribute the snow load on the walls before the structure failed. Outside, the storm whispered its threat, whipping up a thin veil of powdery snow around them. Visibility was near zero. "Dad, it's insane out here," Maggie shouted over the wind. "Nothing we haven't faced," Earl yelled back, though the doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. He climbed to the ladder with Sam following, mittens clumsily gripping the rope. Lily clung to Maggie's hand, stomping through the snow. From above, Earl assessed the walls. The hay had started to sag near the corners, where ice had formed heavy ridges that bent the fibers inward. One slip, one missed brace, and the whole side could buckle. He could almost feel it giving way beneath his hands. "Okay, work slow," he called. "Push snow off the top gradually, don't let it drop all at once." They worked methodically. Shovel by shovel, snow slid down in controlled avalanches. Earl's arms burned, but he ignored it. The wind cut through his coat, stealing body heat faster than he could replenish it. His hands were raw, but he kept going, watching for any further movement in the walls. Below him, Sam and Maggie tried to clear the base. Snow had drifted high enough to create pressure from the bottom as well. The house was holding, but barely. Then came the sharp crack. It wasn't subtle. A beam shifted slightly, bending under the pressure. A portion of the wall wobbled. Earl froze, heart hammering. "Dad," Sam's voice cracked in panic. "Steady, it's okay," Earl shouted, though panic had started to curl in his gut. He pressed his shoulder against the bending bales, feeling them compress and resist. Slowly, painstakingly, he readjusted, pushing and pressing until the wall settled. A shiver ran through him, not from the cold, but from understanding just how close they had come. That night they huddled in the kitchen. The lantern's glow seemed weak against the vast darkness outside. The wind still howled, and snow whipped against the hay walls with relentless fury. Maggie sat beside him, exhaustion etched into her face. "You should have called someone for help," she said quietly. Earl shook his head. "Wouldn't have made it here in time. This is our job." "Your job, Dad, it's insane." He looked at her, at the kids sleeping under blankets pulled tight around them, and felt the weight of the past week pressing on him. "Sometimes insanity's the only thing between you and losing everything," he said softly. Day 6 brought a new challenge. The barn roof had taken the brunt of the storm, and the supports were creaking ominously. Earl's hay walls were holding, but the rest of the ranch was starting to fail under the weight of the winter. He knew he couldn't protect everything, but he could protect the family. Around midday, a snowmobile appeared in the distance. A neighbor, bundled and weary, had finally made it through the drifts. Hank Dawson skidded to a stop, gasping. "You folks okay?" Hank called, kicking snow away from the treads. Earl waved him over. "We're managing." Hank's eyes widened as he took in the house, the bales pressed tight against it and the cleared path that had been carved through the drifts. "I can't believe this," he said. "I've been watching other barns collapse, folks losing cattle. You built what? Walls of hay." Earl just shrugged. "Walls of sense works if you don't panic." Hank studied him. "You need help clearing snow off that roof." "I've got it," Earl said, but Hank shook his head. "Not alone, not today, too much weight." For the first time, Earl considered it. He wasn't invincible. Pride didn't matter. Survival did. By mid-afternoon, they were working together. Earl directing, Hank shoveling, the kids helping with smaller drifts, Maggie passing tools. The storm pressed against them like a living thing, trying to undo every effort. Snow slid from the roof in heavy chunks, ice cracking in the trees around them. Every sound made Earl's heart leap. Was that a branch breaking or the wall giving way? Hours passed. Their bodies ached, fingers were numb beyond pain, and their faces stung from the cold. But slowly, inch by inch, they managed to redistribute the load. The hay walls held firm. The barn groaned but endured. As night fell, Earl stood on the porch, surveying the damage. The world was a frozen, silent wasteland, but inside the walls of hay, warmth lingered. The family huddled around tea. He stove, sharing quiet words, the glow of the lantern painting their faces in shades of amber and gold. Maggie leaned against him. "You weren't crazy," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "Crazy's only bad if it doesn't work." And for now, it worked. But the storm had one final trick. Around midnight, the wind shifted. North turned east. The air sharpened. Snow whistled through unseen gaps, piling differently against the walls. Earl woke to a sound that made his blood run cold, a deep groan from the east side, a heavy compression of bales under fresh weight. He bolted from bed, grabbing the lantern. Maggie followed, wide-eyed. Sam and Lily sat up, panic in their young faces. Earl pressed his shoulder to the sagging wall. The house shifted beneath his weight, a terrifyingly subtle give. He pushed harder, felt the fibers compress, heard the ice crack just slightly. It was a battle between physics and willpower, and he wasn't sure which would win. Hank arrived minutes later, breathless. Together they worked, reinforcing with ropes, adjusting bales, clearing snow. The storm screamed its protest. Every gust tried to bend the structure, every drift tried to crush it. Then finally, as dawn approached, it settled. The sag held. The walls held. For the first time in days, Earl allowed himself to exhale. He looked down at the frozen ground, at the exhausted figures around him, and realized something. This winter could break anyone. But it hadn't broken them. Not yet. And the hay walls, ridiculous, crazy hay walls, had saved them. The quiet after the storm's peak was almost unbearable in its contrast. Outside, the ranch looked like a world abandoned, but inside, life endured. Earl stood, exhausted, and looked at his daughter, at the kids, at Hank. "We're still here," he said. "Yes," Maggie whispered, "thanks to you." Earl shook his head. "Thanks to all of us and a little bit of stubbornness." For the first time, he allowed himself to believe they might make it through. But the wind outside still whispered of more tests to come. The battle wasn't over, not yet. The sun rose weak and pale, a reluctant witness to the aftermath. The wind had finally eased, leaving behind a world that looked pristine but treacherous. Earl stepped onto the porch, boots crunching over ice-crusted snow, and took in the sight of his ranch. Fences bowed under the snow, the barn sagged in places, and the hay walls of the house bore the marks of the storm's wrath. But they were standing. Maggie appeared beside him, hands stuffed deep in her coat pockets, eyes scanning the horizon. "It's quiet," she said, though her voice carried the weight of weeks spent fearing it wouldn't be. "Too quiet," Earl muttered. He wasn't used to mornings like this. In Wyoming, winter had always been loud, wind gnashing at wood, ice cracking, cattle restless. Silence was unnatural after what they'd just survived. Inside, the house smelled faintly of hay, smoke, and burnt coffee. The kids had managed to wake before him, Sam already at the table, pencil moving methodically across paper, Lily coloring with reckless determination. Their energy was a reminder of life continuing, no matter how close it had come to being lost. "Breakfast," Earl said simply, and for a moment everyone moved like a family again, not survivors in a frozen wasteland. By mid-morning, neighbors began to appear. Not everyone, not yet, but enough to show that the word had spread. People who had lost cattle and barns were stopping to see how the Barretts had made it through. Hank Dawson arrived first, carrying more tools than anyone could reasonably need. "I don't know if I believe this," Hank said, rubbing his face with a gloved hand. "I've seen barns collapse like dominoes. You survived." Earl shrugged, not sure he wanted the credit. "We did what we had to." Word of the hay walls had traveled faster than the plows. By noon, strangers from miles away had arrived. Some filmed on phones, others brought notebooks. Questions poured in. How thick were the walls? How long did they take to build? Could this method work for other ranches? Earl answered carefully. "You can, but you've got to understand the land, you've got to understand the animals, and you've got to be willing to work. That's all." The questions kept coming, but for the first time in weeks, Earl felt a sense of something he hadn't known he missed. Respect. Not pity, not disbelief, but respect. Jacob arrived in the late afternoon. He had driven through the cleared roads, the newer truck crunching over the last remnants of snow. He climbed out, looking around, eyes wide. "Dad, I can't believe this," he said. "You're seeing it firsthand now," Earl replied. Jacob's gaze traveled over the house, the barn, the yard packed with neighbors helping each other. "You could have died out here," he said. Earl met his son's eyes. "So could all of us if we didn't fight." Jacob nodded slowly, taking in the scene. The hay walls on. See, the subject of ridicule now stood as proof of endurance and ingenuity. "I should have been here," he admitted quietly. "You are now," Earl said. The storm had done more than threaten their lives. It had reshaped the land, the ranch, and even their relationships. The struggle against nature had reminded them of priorities, of connection, and of resilience. By evening, the community had formed a rhythm. People worked together, clearing paths, reinforcing weakened walls, and moving cattle. The Barretts' ranch had become a hub, a sanctuary built from hay and stubborn determination. The walls that had once been laughed at now inspired hope. Lucas Reed, the small agricultural reporter who had first broadcasted the story, arrived once more. He filmed selectively, letting moments of genuine human endurance speak for themselves. "People are calling this a turning point," he said quietly. "For winter survival, for ranchers everywhere." Earl shook his head. "We're just keeping warm." "But it's more than that," Lucas said. "You reminded everyone that old knowledge still matters. That survival doesn't have to be modern to be effective." Earl glanced at the hay walls, sun glinting off frost and ice, the edges slightly frayed but unwavering. He thought of Margaret, of his father, of the land they had tended for generations. "We did what we could," he said simply. That night the first genuine calm arrived. No wind, no groaning hay, no cracking ice. Only the faint sounds of breathing, the slow exhale of animals within their insulated enclosures. Earl stepped outside, the air still sharp but forgiving. The horizon stretched wide and white, and for the first time in weeks he allowed himself to relax. He stood by the hay wall, placing a hand against it, feeling warmth seeping faintly through the frozen surface. Life had endured inside this fragile, ridiculous structure. His family had endured. They had survived. Jacob joined him side by side. Neither spoke at first. The silence wasn't heavy, it was relief, shared and unspoken. "You really did it," Jacob said finally. "No," Earl replied, "we did it." By spring, the ranch bore the scars of winter but also the promise of new beginnings. Snowbanks melted, revealing twisted fences and flattened fields. The hay walls had held, a monument to endurance, ingenuity, and stubborn care. The cattle returned to open pastures, healthy and strong. Letters and calls came from across the country. People had lost homes, barns, and herds, and they wanted to know how it was possible. Earl answered each one with care. His advice wasn't just about hay walls, it was about observation, preparation, and listening to the land. Jacob stayed, choosing to help rebuild and guide the ranch alongside his father. Maggie and the children thrived in the renewed rhythm of life, the memory of the storm a shadow that reinforced their bond rather than breaking it. By June, the hay-covered walls were more than survival, they were a symbol. School groups visited. Ranchers came to learn. A simple wooden sign went up near the road, the Hay Dome, winter of '25. People marveled at how something so seemingly fragile had held against a winter that few could survive. Earl often sat outside in the late afternoons, watching the calves kick up their heels, listening to wind stirring through the grass rather than snow. Lucas came by one last time, notebook and camera in hand. "People are calling you a hero," Lucas said. Earl snorted, "Heroes die young." Lucas smiled. "Then maybe you're something better, you outlasted it." Earl's eyes traced the hay walls, the fields, the horizon stretching endlessly. The winter had tried to erase them, to prove the land stronger than man. But it hadn't, not completely. They had endured, and the old ways, the stubbornness, the patience, the knowledge passed down generations, had carried them through. Sometimes survival didn't look like steel or concrete. Sometimes it looked like hay stacked just right, walls that breathed warmth into a frozen world, and a family determined to hold on. Earl pressed his hand against the hay wall one last time, feeling the faint heat through frozen fibers. A quiet pride filled him. The worst winter in 50 years had arrived, threatened, and raged, but it had met its match. And this time the Barretts had won.